The ideology of hero cult is what gives us, in great measure, this thing called the polis. And then what we find in the 5th century is people like Herodotus, Thucydides, and Plato, to a certain extent, coming off of that, thinking that the polis of Athens, as it has been constituted, as it was constituted with Homer as its cultural center. And we know that the school that young Athenians went to, the kind of school that they went to, involved a lot of Homer as the primary educational material, which is, among other things, why Plato is so hot to get rid of Homer from his ideal city in the Republic. That's the big cultural material, and these new thinkers, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plato, are saying, wait a second, maybe we need a different kind of political theory, maybe we need a different kind of ideology, to use that kind of broad term for the sum total of the assumptions upon which culture rests. Maybe we need to do something else and do a different kind of education. But of course, beyond the fact that we're going to talk in the next segment about how Plato's critique actually lets us into something powerful that video games can do for us. Beyond that, what we can see is in the very vehemence that Herodotus, Thucydides, and Plato feel about Homer's inappropriateness to the current situation in the polis in the 5th century, again, the 400s, what we can see is just how prevalent that ideology was and just how thoroughly the old interactive formation of the community through the bardic tradition that gave us Homer, that's continuing to be performed even though it's starting to kind of die off as a living tradition, just how powerful that is. And maybe the best example to go to draw a line to from what Naj says about hero cult, is Plato's Ion, which is a dialogue that depicts Socrates, and this is almost certainly a very early dialogue of Plato, so what we're dealing with is a more or less historical Socrates, unlike the less historical, more fictional Socrates that Plato uses later in his career. Ion appears to show Socrates at his most historical, his most elenkizing, using this technique of the elenchus, the cross-examination, by which he goes around Athens, as he tells us in his own Apology, which is the end of his life, but almost certainly the beginning of Plato's career in the first dialogue of Socrates that Plato wrote. Socrates tells us there that he went around Athens interrogating people. And one of the first people that we find him interrogating is a rhapsode. Now, this is the place to do a little digression on the difference between a rhapsode, Greek rhapsodos, and a bard, Greek oidos. And oidos is just a singer. A rhapsodos is a person who stitches songs together, at least as it's etymologized later. It's more probable that his name comes from the fact that he holds a staff called a rhabudos. But in any case, the rhapsode is the later descendant of the bard within the tradition of Homer, and a rhapsode almost certainly is reciting from memory and kind of tricking out the poetry with all sorts of devices and fancy costumes, and this is what Socrates makes fun of him for. And the fact that he's holding a staff must mean that he's not holding a lyre. So he's not a bard anymore. The bardic tradition is more or less dead, and what we have instead are performances by rhapsodes keeping these old stories alive. And whereas the bard would have recomposed the story every time, the rhapsode is singing more or less the same story, but he's maintaining that interactive nature by the way he interprets it. And it's that interpretation that Socrates wants to criticize, and so he's very hard on Ion, and he makes it clear that Ion, who claims to be a kind of rock star of education, that is, somebody who can deliver the lessons that Homer gives, these lessons that are at the center of Athenian education, Socrates proves that in fact he doesn't know anything. And it's Plato's opening salvo in what might be called a war against Homer, ending in what he calls in the Republic the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. But all of that really, I think, is just to say the Homeric tradition, the tradition that is in the bards, in their performances on the bardic occasions that we talked about way back at the beginning of the course, that tradition gave to the polis its original being, its original community. And the fact that it was so strong is what makes it such a big target, if you will, for people like Herodotus, Thucydides, and above all Plato to take on. That is, Homeric epic, with its interactive nature, is at the very root of community and polis for ancient Athens.